Design Build, Risk Management, Lessons Learned. This is Lesson 7, Comply with Plans and Specifications, even if you wrote them. This is Kent Holland, ConstructionRisk, LLC. First case we're going to talk about here is Strand Construction. It's an Armed Services Board of Contract Appeals decision of 2008. By submitting a proposal in response to an RFP, the design builder represents that it can meet the performance specs. Now, in this case, the RFP called for windows at an Alaska air base. It was required that these windows meet blast requirements and also meet high thermal requirements. The design builder could not locate commercially available windows and had to custom build them instead. The government denied a change order, REA, for the additional cost of the windows. The board held that the design builder represented that it could meet the performance specs by submitting the proposal, and that failure to adequately investigate the availability of the windows was the design builder's risk. The next case is FSEC Inc, Board of Contract Appeals 1999 decision, where the RFP includes design prescriptive specs and performance specs. Both must be met. The government drawings in this case depicted 4 dust collectors and 4 exhaust fans. The government specs included 2 different cross-draft ventilation rates. One was 110 feet per minute and the other was 60 feet per minute. So this was somewhat of an ambiguity. The design builder sought to meet the performance specs for ventilation by using different airflow and different numbers of exhaust fans and dust collectors than what was prescribed and what the design specs called for. The design builder argued that a design build contract gives the design builder flexibility to meet the performance requirements differently than what is prescribed. Now, I've got to tell you, I've had clients that have wanted me to make that argument, and I'm always uncomfortable with that, because if you look at the case law, you're going to find many decisions just like this one that say that if the government prescribes detailed design requirements and also has performance requirements, the design builder is not relieved of meeting those design details merely because of the form of contract being design build rather than design bid build. It's treated exactly the same. In this case, the board held that the design builder must follow the detailed design specs even if it can meet the performance another way, and it held that the design builder should have sought clarification on the flow rate. So consequently it had to meet the higher rate. The court explained the following, quote, "Obligations imposed by the specs determine the extent to which a particular spec is either performance or prescriptive, and it is not uncommon for a contract to contain both." Close quote. Well, what if it's impossible to meet the performance specs? When the design builder argues that it should be excused from a guarantee due to the impossibility to meet the performance requirements, the courts consider the following: the contract terms and the relative knowledge of the parties regarding the specifications. In Colorado Ute versus Envirotech, a Colorado decision, the design builder agreed to meet performance requirements tied into state or quality standards and warranted that it would bear cost of all corrective measures until continuous compliance was achieved. The court found that the design builder expressly warranted that it could provide satisfactory precipitators and thus assumed the risk of impossibility. The design builder in this case asserted that the owner had failed to provide design temperatures and flue gas volumes that were required by the contract. The court found that the design builder had made an express warranty that it would provide satisfactory equipment and assumed all risk of impossibility. And the court also found this to be the sale of goods under the Uniform Commercial Code, the UCC. And with that, a warranty for fitness of the goods for their intended purpose existed. Now, I find that aspect particularly troubling, finding that something like this is a good for sale that is subject to the Uniform Commercial Code. But as you look at decisions around the country, you will see that some very large things like water tanks are sometimes found to be a product or a good that is subject to the Uniform Commercial Code. Consequently, when I see language in contracts that suggests that there is a fitness for intended purpose or merchantable product, etc., I take a serious look at that and often recommend striking that language to say, no, we are not giving you a UCC type of a warranty. Let's look at another decision that really helps us to focus in on the distinction between performance and design specs and how contractors must meet the design specs in addition to performance. In the case of Dillingham Construction versus the United States, there's a Federal Claims Court decision of '95. In this case, what we see is if the owner includes design details in its bidding documents, these are going to be binding on the design builder. When responding to the design build solicitation, the design builder needs to understand which aspects of the concept documents that are developed by the owner, these so-called bridging documents, will be discretionary and which ones are mandatory. In this case, there were electrical specs in the solicitation that described conduit size and characteristics, as well as details of the supports for the raceways. Dillingham's electrical sub wanted to use metal-clad cable instead of raceways. The owner rejected that proposal. When the sub installed supports differing from those that were specified, the owner required them to be removed and replaced. The sub then submitted a $600,000 claim for extra costs that it incurred to comply with these requirements of the owner. It argued that the specs were performance-based and that they provided, quote, general guidelines, close quote, giving the sub, quote, wide latitude, close quote, to interpret. The court found the specs were, in fact, design specs and gave the sub no flexibility to deviate whatsoever. The court rejected the sub's argument and noted that the contract specifically required the sub to furnish a design that complied with the electrical specs. The next case is C&L Construction, another Board of Contract Appeals decision. And in this one, it was found that the design builder cannot substitute plywood siding for pre-finished polyvinyl hardwood that had been specified. After bidding, or after being awarded the design-build contract, the contractor asserted that it intended to use T111 plywood as siding as permitted by one of the spec sections, but there was a drawing submitted with the design builder's proposal that showed it was going to use polyvinyl fluoride coated hardwood, PVF siding. This was, in fact, consistent with another one of the spec sections. During price negotiations, the design builder sought to use plywood. The government refused to allow the plywood, which it said was an unauthorized substitution. The board held that the specs did not allow the use of the plywood. Even if there had been an ambiguity, the government made it clear during negotiations with the design builder that it wanted the PVF vinyl siding, and that is what the approved contract incorporated by way of the technical specs. Next case is Sherman Smoot Corporation, another Board of Contract Appeals decision. In this case, the design builder was not permitted to substitute steel lighting fixtures for aluminum fixtures that it had included in its technical proposal. So the government spec for renovation of the buildings called for a type A1 fixture that was recessed mounting, had 2x4 made of rolled steel to produce a 50-foot candle illumination. The design builder proposed or submitted a proposal that had a catalog cut of a specific company and model fixture made with extruded aluminum. The government accepted the proposal and later rejected the design builder's attempt to substitute different fixtures made of steel because it was inferior in quality and look to the fixtures that had been included with the design builder's technical proposal. So in other words, the design builder proposed aluminum like what the government spec called for, but later wants to substitute steel and essentially argues, hey, it's a design build contract, steel is good enough, it meets your performance needs, you've got to take it. The board held that there is no legal authority to support the design builder's argument that when a brand name is offered by the design builder and incorporated into the contract, the FAR clause would allow the design builder to use a substitute product of the same standard of quality in accordance with that clause. Got to tell you, this argument comes up far too often by design builders who actually, in the context of their proposal, submit a gold-plated proposal, something really extraordinarily nice. The government awards the contract based on that, and then the design builder realizes that it overpromised and that it's unrealistic. And I've had situations where design builders have put in 10-foot ceilings in kitchens, and it called for the kitchen cabinets to go to the ceiling. Well, that was kind of ridiculous, but the government said, we want our kitchen cabinets to go to the ceiling. Well, you can't reach 10 feet, but the government insisted that the contractor either put in these custom-built cabinets or give the government a credit, which it would be due. This may sound preposterous, but the message is, if you put it in your proposal and the government relies on it in giving you the award, they're going to hold you to it. So be very careful what you propose, and if you're going to then deviate from what you proposed, you're going to have to go right through the same procedures that any contractor would go through to deviate from the approved plans and specifications and submittal. The next case we're going to talk about is Crest Construction, a federal claims court decision of 2004. In this case, the design builder was held to be required to build what it included in its technical proposal and can't later require the government to accept a different site plan. The government has authority to reject the design builder's revised site planning as non-conforming, where the plan differed from the design that was submitted with the best and final offer. And this was regardless of whether the design builder could show that its revised plan would give the government a better or more economical and best use of its site. The board held, if the site plan proposals included in the technical proposal with the BAFO resulted in excessive work, the government had the right to insist on the site plan it wanted. And that was what was included in the BAFO by the design builder. So in other words, the government can require that the design builder give exactly what was proposed, even if it doesn't make sense ultimately. It can get what the design builder promised. The next case is Blake Construction versus United States, Federal Circuit Court case of 1993. In this one, the contractor must remove underground duct banks for the electrical installation and install the ducts overhead as shown in the government specs. Well, the RFP included drawings for the installation of electrical conduits. It showed them installed overhead, hanging either exposed from utility racks or hidden above a drop ceiling. Notes on the drawings stated that they were diagrammatic. Diagrammatic notes advised the contractor to avoid interference with other trades, and the contractor had some flexibility in how to do that according to these notes. The problem was that the contractor found that the electric couldn't be installed exactly as depicted and couldn't avoid interference with the other trades if done above ground. So the contractor's solution was install the electric underground. Well, the government required the removal of the underground duct bank and the installation above ground as specified. And the court held where there is a combination of design specs and performance specs, the contractor has to meet both. There's a great description of the difference in design and performance specs in this case. So if you really want to read a really nice description by a court of how design specs differ from performance specs, I recommend reading this decision. The next case is MSD Construction, another Board of Contract Appeals decision. In this case, the contractor was not entitled to an REA or a change order where the roofing spec was either patently ambiguous or latently ambiguous. The specs here had called for roof repair using lightweight concrete, but in another section called for asphaltic concrete. So there was a conflict between these two sections. But the contractor submitted its bid intending to use the less expensive way of doing it. And the government rejected the substitution, saying, well, you gave us your bid, you promised to be responsive to the specs, and the specs intended the asphaltic concrete. The board held that the ambiguity in the spec was very apparent. It's what we would call patent. And as a patent ambiguity, the contractor had a duty to inquire pre-bid about that patent ambiguity, and it failed to do so. Therefore, it's bound to perform as the government desires. Even if this was a latent ambiguity, however, that was not discovered until after the contract was awarded, the contractor must still prove how it priced its bid with the less expensive material. And in this case, it failed to do so. We will next go to Lesson 8, the owner's implied warranty of the owner-provided bridging specs.